The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie. Chapter 17. Parker. It occurred to me the next morning that under the exhilaration produced by Tin Ho or the perfect winning, I might have been slightly indiscreet. True, Poirot had not asked me to keep the discovery of the ring to myself. On the other hand, he had said nothing about it whilst at Fernley, and as far as I knew, I was the only person aware that it had been found. I felt distinctly guilty. The fact was by now spreading through King's Abbot like wildfire. I was expecting wholesale reproaches from Poirot at any minute. The joint funeral of Mrs. Ferrars and Roger Ackroyd was fixed for 11 o'clock. It was a melancholy and impressive ceremony. All the party from Fernley were there. After it was over, Poirot, who had also been present, took me by the arm and invited me to accompany him back to the Larches. He was looking very grave, and I fear that my indiscretion of the night before had got round to his ears. But it soon transpired that his thoughts were occupied by something of a totally different nature. "See you," he said, "we must act. With your help I propose to examine a witness. We will question him, we will put such fear into him that the truth is bound to come out." "What witness are you talking about?" I asked, very much surprised. "Parker," said Poirot. "I asked him to be at my house this morning at 12 o'clock. He should await us there at this very minute." "What do you think?" I ventured, glancing sideways at his face.
"I know this, that I am not satisfied."
"You think that it was he who blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars?"
"Either that, or—"
"Well," I said, after waiting a minute or two.
"My friend, I will say this to you, I hope it was he."
The gravity of his manner and something indefinable that tinged it reduced me to silence. On arrival at the Larches, we were informed that Parker was already there, awaiting our return. As we entered the room, the butler rose respectfully.
"Good morning, Parker," said Poirot pleasantly. "One instant, I pray of you."
He removed his overcoat and gloves. "Allow me, sir," said Parker, and sprang forward to assist him. He deposited the articles neatly on a chair by the door. Poirot watched him with approval.
"Thank you, my good Parker," he said. "Take a seat, will you not? What I have to say may take some time."
Parker seated himself with an apologetic bend of the head.
"Now what do you think I asked you to come here for this morning, eh?"
Parker coughed. "I understood, sir, that you wished to ask me a few questions about my late master, private-like."
"Precisement," said Poirot, beaming. "Have you made many experiments in blackmail?"
"Sir!"
The butler sprang to his feet. "Do not excite yourself," said Poirot placidly. "Do not play the farce of the honest injured man. You know all there is to know about the blackmail, is it not so?"
"Sir, I've never been—"
"Insulted," suggested Poirot, "in such a way before. Then why, my excellent Parker, were you so anxious to overhear the conversation in Mr. Ackroyd's study the other evening, after you had caught the word blackmail?"
"I wasn't—
"Who was your last master?" rapped out Poirot suddenly.
"My last master?"
"Yes, the master you were with before you came to Mr. Ackroyd."
"A Major Ellaby, sir."
Poirot took the words out of his mouth. "Just so, Major Ellaby. Major Ellaby was addicted to drugs, was he not? You travelled about with him. When he was in Bermuda, there was some trouble. A man was killed. Major Ellaby was partly responsible. It was hushed up, but you knew about it. How much did Major Ellaby pay you to keep your mouth shut?"
Parker was staring at him open-mouthed. The man had gone to pieces. His cheek shook flabbily.
"You see, I have made inquiries," said Poirot pleasantly. "It is as I say, you got a good sum then as blackmail, and Major Ellaby went on paying you until he died. Now I want to hear about your latest experiment."
Parker still stared.
"It is useless to deny, Hercule Poirot knows. It is so, what I have said about Major Ellaby, is it not?"
As though against his will, Parker nodded reluctantly once. His face was ashen pale. "But I never hurt a hair of Mr. Ackroyd's head," he moaned. "Honest to God, sir, I didn't. I've been afraid of this coming all the time, and I tell you I didn't kill him." His voice rose almost to a scream.
"I am inclined to believe you, my friend," said Poirot. "You have not the nerve, the courage, but I must have the truth."
"I'll tell you anything, sir, anything you want to know. It's true that I tried to listen that night. A word or two I heard made me curious. And Mr. Ackroyd's wanting not to be disturbed and shutting himself up with the doctor the way he did. It's God's own truth what I told the police. I heard the word blackmail, sir, and, well—"
He paused. "You thought there might be something in it for you," suggested Poirot smoothly.
Well, yes, I did, sir. I thought that if Mr. Ackroyd was being blackmailed, why shouldn't I have a share of the pickings?"
A very curious expression passed over Poirot's face. He leaned forward. Had you any reason to suppose before that night that Mr. Ackroyd was being blackmailed?
No, indeed, sir. It was a great surprise to me. Such a regular gentleman in all his habits.
How much did you overhear?
Not very much, sir. There seemed what I might call a spite against me. Of course, I had to attend to my duties in the pantry, and when I did creep along once or twice to the study, it was no use. The first time Dr. Shepherd came out and almost caught me in the act, and another time Mr. Raymond passed me in the big hall and went that way, so I knew it was no use. And when I went in with the tray, Miss Flora headed me off.
Poirot stared for a long time at the man, as if to test his sincerity. Parker returned his gaze earnestly.
I hope you'll believe me, sir. I've been afraid all along the police would rake up that old business with Major Ellerby and be suspicious of me in consequence.
"Eh bien," said Poirot at last, "I am disposed to believe you, but there is one thing I must request of you, to show me your bank-book. You have a bank-book, I presume?"
"Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, I have it with me now."
With no sign of confusion, he produced it from his pocket. Poirot took the slim green-covered book and perused the entries. "I perceive you have purchased £500 worth of National Savings Certificates this year."
"Yes, sir. I have already over £1,000 saved, the result of my connection with my late master, Mr. Ellerby. And I have had quite a little flutter on some horses this year, very successful. If you remember, sir, a rank outsider won the Jubilee. I was fortunate enough to back it, £20.
Poirot handed him back the book. "I will wish you good morning. I believe that you have told me the truth. If you have not, so much the worse for you, my friend." When Parker had departed, Poirot picked up his overcoat once more. "Going out again?" I asked. "Yes, we will pay a little visit to the good Monsieur Hammond." "You believe Parker's story?" "It is credible enough on the face of it. It seems clear that unless he is a very good actor indeed, he genuinely believes it was Ackroyd himself who was the victim of blackmail. If so, he knows nothing at all about Mrs. Ferrers's business." "Then in that case, who?" "Précisément, who? But our visit to Monsieur Hammond will accomplish one purpose. It will either clear Parker completely, or else—" "Well?" "I fall into the bad habit of leaving my sentences unfinished this morning," said Poirot apologetically. "You must bear with me." "By the way," I said rather sheepishly, "I've got a confession to make. I'm afraid I have inadvertently let out something about that ring." "Which ring?" "The ring you found in the goldfish pond." "Ah, yes," said Poirot, smiling broadly. "I hope you're not annoyed. It was very careless of me." "But not at all, my good friend, not at all. I laid no commands upon you. You were at liberty to speak of it if you so wished. She was interested, your sister."
"She was indeed. It created a sensation. All sorts of theories are flying about."
"Ah, and yet it is so simple. The true explanation leapt to the eye, did it not?" "Did it?" I said dryly. Poirot laughed. "The wise man does not commit himself," he observed. "Is that not so? But here we are at Mr. Hammond's." The lawyer was in his office, and we were ushered in without any delay. He rose and greeted us in his dry, precise manner. Poirot came at once to the point. "Monsieur, I desire from you certain information, that is, if you will be so good as to give it to me. You acted, I understand, for the late Mrs. Ferrers of King's Paddock." I noticed the swift gleam of surprise which showed in the lawyer's eyes, before his professional reserve came down once more like a mask over his face.
"Certainly. All her affairs passed through our hands."
"Very good. Now, before I ask you to tell me anything, I should like you to listen to the story Dr. Shepherd will relate to you. You have no objection, have you, my friend, to repeating the conversation you had with Mr. Ackroyd last Friday night?"
"Not in the least," I said, and straightway began the recital of that strange evening. Hammond listened with close attention. "That is all," I said when I had finished. "Blackmail," said the lawyer thoughtfully.
"You are surprised?" asked Poirot.
The lawyer took off his pince-nez and polished them with his handkerchief. "No," he replied, "I can hardly say that I am surprised. I have suspected something of the kind for some time."
"That brings us," said Poirot, "to the information for which I am asking. If anyone can give us an idea of the actual sums paid, you are the man, monsieur."
"I see no object in withholding the information," said Hammond after a moment or two. "During the past year, Mrs. Ferrers has sold out certain securities, and the money for them was paid into her account and not reinvested. As her income was a large one, and she lived very quietly after her husband's death, it seems certain that these sums of money were paid away for some special purpose. I once sounded her on the subject, and she said that she was obliged to support several of her husband's poor relations. I let the matter drop, of course. Until now, I have always imagined that the money was paid to some woman who had a claim on Ashley Ferrers. I never dreamed that Mrs. Ferrers herself was involved." "And the amount?" asked Poirot. "In all, I should say that the various sums totaled at least £20,000. £20,000!" I exclaimed. "In 1 year!" "Mrs. Ferrers was a very wealthy woman," said Poirot dryly, "and the penalty for murder is not a pleasant one." "Is there anything else that I can tell you?" inquired Mr. Hammond. "I thank you, no," said Poirot, rising. "All my excuses for having deranged you." "Not at all, not at all." "The word derange," I remarked when we were outside again, "is applicable to mental disorder only." "Ah!" cried Poirot, "never will my English be quite perfect. A curious language. I should then have said disarranged, n'est-ce pas?" "Disturbed is the word you had in mind." "I thank you, my friend, the word exact. You are zealous for it. Ah bien, what about our friend Parker now? With £20,000 in hand, would he have continued being a butler? Je ne pense pas. It is of course possible that he banked the money under another name, but I am disposed to believe he spoke the truth to us. If he is a scoundrel, he is a scoundrel on a mean scale. He has not the big ideas. That leaves us as a possibility Raymond, or, well, Major Blunt." "Surely not Raymond," I objected, "since we know that he was desperately hard up for a matter of £500. "That is what he says, yes. And as to Hector Blunt—" "I will tell you something as to the good Major Blunt," interrupted Poirot. "It is my business to make inquiries. I make them. Ah bien, that legacy of which he speaks, I have discovered that the amount of it was close upon £20,000. What do you think of that?" I was so taken aback that I could hardly speak. "It's impossible," I said at last. "A well-known man like Hector Blunt—" Poirot shrugged his shoulders. "Who knows? At least he is a man with big ideas. I confess that I hardly see him as a blackmailer, but there is another possibility that you have not even considered." "What is that?" "The fire, my friend. Ackroyd himself may have destroyed that letter, blue envelope and all, after you left him." "I hardly think that likely," I said slowly. "And yet, of course, it may be so. He might have changed his mind." We had just arrived at my house, and on the spur of the moment I invited Poirot to come in and take potluck. I thought Caroline would be pleased with me, but it is hard to satisfy one's womenfolk. It appears that we were eating chops for lunch, the kitchen staff being regaled on tripe and onions, and 2 chops set before 3 people are productive of embarrassment. But Caroline is seldom daunted for long. With magnificent mendacity, she explained to Poirot that although James laughed at her for doing so, she adhered strictly to a vegetarian diet. She descanted ecstatically on the delights of nut cutlets, which I am quite sure she has never tasted, and ate a Welsh rarebit with gusto and frequent cutting remarks as to the dangers of flesh foods. Afterwards, when we were sitting in front of the fire and smoking, Caroline attacked Poirot directly. "Not found Ralph Peyton yet?" she asked. "Where should I find him, mademoiselle?" "I thought perhaps you'd found him in Cranchester," said Caroline with intense meaning in her tone. Poirot looked merely bewildered. "In Cranchester? But why in Cranchester?" I enlightened him with a touch of malice. "One of our ample staff of private detectives happened to see you in a car on the Cranchester road yesterday," I explained. Poirot's bewilderment vanished. He laughed heartily. "Ah, that, a simple visit to the dentist, c'est tout. My tooth it aches. I go there. My tooth it is at once better. I think to return quickly. The dentist, he says no, better to have it out. I argue. He insists. He has his way. That particular tooth, it will never ache again." Caroline collapsed rather like a pricked balloon. We fell to discussing Ralph Peyton. "A weak nature," I insisted, "but not a vicious one." "Ah," said Poirot, "but weakness, where does it end?" "Exactly," said Caroline. "Take James here. Weak as water if I weren't about to look after him." "My dear Caroline," I said irritably, "can't you talk without dragging in personalities?" "You are weak, James," said Caroline, quite unmoved. "I'm 8 years older than you are. Oh, I don't mind Monsieur Poirot knowing that." "I should never have guessed it, mademoiselle," said Poirot with a gallant little bow. 8 years older, and I've always considered it my duty to look after you. With a bad bringing up, heaven knows what mischief you might have got into by now." "I might have married a beautiful adventuress," I murmured, gazing at the ceiling and blowing smoke rings. "Adventuress," said Caroline with a snort. "If we're talking of adventuresses—" She left the sentence unfinished. "Well?" I said, with some curiosity. "Nothing, but I can think of someone not 100 miles away." Then she turned to Poirot suddenly. "James sticks to it that you believe someone in the house committed the murder. All I can say is, you're wrong." "I should not like to be wrong," said Poirot. "It is not, how do you say, my métier." "I've got the facts pretty clearly," continued Caroline, taking no notice of Poirot's remark, "from James and others. As far as I can see, of the people in the house, only two could have had the chance of doing it, Ralph Peyton and Flora Ackroyd." "My dear Caroline—" "Now, James, don't interrupt me. I know what I'm talking about. Parker met her outside the door, didn't he? He didn't hear her uncle saying good night to her. She could have killed him then and there." "Caroline!" "I'm not saying she did, James. I'm saying she could have done." As a matter of fact, though, Flora is like all these young girls nowadays, with no veneration for their betters and thinking they know best on every subject under the sun. I don't for a minute believe she'd kill even a chicken. But there it is. Mr. Raymond and Major Blunt have alibis. Mrs. Ackroyd's got an alibi. Even that Russell woman seems to have one, and a good job for her it is, she has. Who's left? Only Ralph and Flora. And say what you will, I don't believe Ralph Peyton is a murderer, a boy we've known all our lives. Poirot was silent for a minute, watching the curling smoke rise from his cigarette. When at last he spoke, it was in a gentle, far-away voice that produced a curious impression. It was totally unlike his usual manner. "Let us take a man, a very ordinary man, a man with no idea of murder in his heart. There is in him somewhere a strain of weakness deep down. It has so far never been called into play. Perhaps it never will be. And if so, he will go to his grave honored and respected by everyone. But let us suppose that something occurs. He is in difficulties, or perhaps not that even. He may stumble by accident on a secret involving life or death to someone, and his first impulse will be to speak out, to do his duty as an honest citizen. And then the strain of weakness tells. Here is a chance of money, a great amount of money. He wants money, he desires it, and it is so easy. He has to do nothing for it, just keep silence. That is the beginning. The desire for money grows. He must have more and more. He is intoxicated by the gold mine which is opened at his feet. He becomes greedy, and in his greed he overreaches himself. One can press a man as far as one likes, but with a woman one must not press too far, for a woman has at heart a great desire to speak the truth. How many husbands who have deceived their wives go comfortably to their graves, carrying their secret with them? How many wives who have deceived their husbands wreck their lives by throwing the fact in those same husbands' teeth? They have been pressed too far. In a reckless moment, which they will afterwards regret, bien entendu, they fling safety to the winds and turn at bay, proclaiming the truth with great momentary satisfaction to themselves. So it was, I think, in this case. The strain was too great. And so there came your proverb, the death of the goose that laid the golden eggs. But that is not the end. Exposure faced the man of whom we are speaking, and he is not the same man he was, say, a year ago. His moral fibre is blunted. He is desperate. He is fighting a losing battle, and he is prepared to take any means that come to his hand, for exposure means ruin to him. And so the dagger strikes. He was silent for a moment. It was as though he had laid a spell upon the room. I cannot try to describe the impression his words produced. There was something in the merciless analysis and the ruthless power of vision which struck fear into both of us. "Afterwards," he went on softly, "the dagger removed, he will be himself again, normal, kindly. But if the need again arises, then once more he will strike." Caroline roused herself at last. "You are speaking of Ralph Peyton," she said. "You may be right, you may not, but you have no business to condemn a man unheard." The telephone bell rang sharply. I went out into the hall and took off the receiver. "What?" I said. "Yes, Dr. Shepherd speaking." I listened for a minute or two, then replied briefly. Replacing the receiver, I went back into the drawing-room. "Poirot," I said, "they have detained a man at Liverpool. His name is Charles Kent, and he is believed to be the stranger who visited Fernley that night. They want me to go to Liverpool at once and identify him."